Hello, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. One of the certainly interesting fields to go ahead and look at when it comes to history is probably archaeology. In order to get involved with this field, you have to have a passion for history, and you have to have a passion for going ahead and getting yourself dirty on basically a daily basis. And so, while we certainly go ahead and look at our movie icon of Indiana Jones, life isn't necessarily all the same as it is for Indy. And so, in order to understand more about archaeology in Northern Virginia, joining us today is Senior Archaeologist to Fairfax County Public Parks Authority, and that's Christopher Sperling. Christopher, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And so, I guess the big question is, are you the Fairfax Indiana Jones?
No, not really. Archaeology as it's practiced is a lot more meticulous. It's based in scientific method. We do a lot of things that are very detailed. The biggest, probably most important thing that an archaeologist does is take notes. And when it comes to the end-all product, it's writing, it's getting the information out there.
So definitely fewer Nazis, more note-taking.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Okay. Many more pencils than whips.
All right. So now that we know, fiction versus reality, what got you interested in archaeology to begin with?
As a child, I grew up in the country, and as a country boy does, I used to take the dog out and go for long hikes in cornfields. And I must have been about 6 or 7 years old, and I found my first Native American stone tool. And after that, I was just fascinated with this, something that you could touch in your hand that people made hundreds, if not thousands, or even 10,000 years ago. Then I was fortunate. My father went back into the State Department, and we found ourselves in places like Mexico, where we could go to Aztec and Mayan. And once you have the bug, that was about it. And I started coursework as an undergraduate and never looked back.
Well, there you go. And so when you go ahead and get involved with archaeology, certainly, there's that, you said yourself, there's that thrill of finding the first find. And so, you look at Northern Virginia and you look at this region, how rich is Northern Virginia in archaeological, is it an archaeological gold mine, or is it really one of those things where you've got to really track where it could be?
A little bit of both. What I can say is that in many respects, thanks to my predecessor in my position, Fairfax County has more archaeological sites registered with the state of Virginia than any other county in the Commonwealth. We have archaeological sites in the county and in places you wouldn't expect for as developed as the county is. We have preserved sites that are as much as 10 to maybe even 10, 12,000 years old. All the way up through Civil War sites and even more modern. As we say, things become historic. More things become historic every day. And especially with archaeology, where we look at the things, we look at what culture has produced and what that tells us about how they lived, that we can really contribute things. We can really contribute to a discussion that sometimes history doesn't have, that history has failed to record. And in that respect, history and archaeology can work really, really well together. And it's a wonderful dynamic.
Now, since you say you have sites that are up to 12,000 years old, what is the oldest site then in Virginia, or at least in Northern Virginia?
In Northern Virginia, and in this time, we're looking at huge spans. And as a result, sometimes it's hard to narrow it down very, very tightly. But in the 10 to 12,000 year range, and at that time in Northern Virginia, climatically, the environment is completely different. It's several degrees cooler. It's more wet, and sea level is considerably lower. And so you have to look at things a lot differently. Most of the area, instead of being forested, was grassland. It was more like a savanna. The people who were here were small band hunter-gatherers, and they followed their resources where they could take them. So that's probably, those are what we're looking at, and they're very, very rare to find, partially because of sea level rise. Most peoples like to keep fairly close to water. And also because they lived and moved around so much in such small bands, the amount of materials they left behind that survived that long which really oftentimes is no much more than the stone artifacts, or much more commonly, just the chips for making those stone artifacts are sometimes all we find or all we have to go on.
Now, what is the current project that you're working on at this point in time? I think it's called Old Colchester?
So I'm working on several projects. Old Colchester is one of the most important. It's been an ongoing project since 2010. I was first hired by the Park Authority to lead one of the teams that was doing the field investigations. The park, the Old Colchester Park and Preserve, was acquired by the Park Authority because it is extraordinarily rich in both natural and cultural resources. The oldest site that we've identified on that property is about 10,000 years old. Again, these small band hunter-gatherers. And it also includes about 25% of the historic port town of Colchester. The town of Colchester developed in as a town, a tobacco inspection station in the 1750s. Every class of people would have been there. You would have had your wealthiest merchants and planters. George Washington shopped just across the street at the Henderson store. George Mason was well involved. Some of the most prominent figures in colonial Fairfax were there, all the way to your artisans, your skilled trades, sailors, slaves, all manner of goods and people, ideas going out and coming back in. And this is what makes these colonial port towns really special. So many of those people who made up the rich diversity of those towns never had the ability to leave their mark historically, but as I like to say, all of them left behind trash. And as a result of the trash they're leaving behind, and trash is honest, is that enables you to then reinsert them into the record, to put them alongside the Masons and the Washingtons.
Now, since Old Colchester is a port town, where is its exact location in relation to how we would look at the map today?
Sure. It's in southern Fairfax County. It is at the very close to where the Occoquan meets the Potomac River, a little bit upstream from there, just downriver from the town of Occoquan, but of course on the Fairfax side.
And so would this be in relation to, in Fairfax County, there's the Old Colchester Road. That would be the road that would have led right to it, or is it just a conveniently named location?
That's exactly it. It ends at Old Colchester. As we like to say, if you take Old Colchester to the end, if your feet get wet, you've gone a little too far, but otherwise you're downtown Colchester.
All right, so you're right there
Yes.
where you need to be.
And you'd never think that you were, because the only thing that are there now is ranch houses, or ranch houses that were built in the 1950s period. Colchester did something that is really odd, in that so many of these historic colonial port towns developed as a port town, and then it continually developed, and that would be Hampton, Newport News, Annapolis. And so there, the history is oftentimes buried or obliterated by later development. Colchester, it developed as a town, but then the port silted in. And rather than being built up and expanded, what ended up happening is the land mostly reverted to field, to agriculture. And then later in the 20th century, mid-20th century, there were relatively large lots with small houses on them. And as a result, a lot of the town of Colchester, much to our surprise, was preserved. Just being down there, we knew George Mason University had done archaeological investigations in the 80s and had identified one stone foundation. In the work that we've been doing there, just in the town part, and we've done a lot of work outside of town, we've already discovered 3 more structures at least, none of which that we knew were there. And we weren't sure if they were going to be intact or if they would have been disturbed by later activity, but so far, a remarkable state of preservation.
Now, in creating this preservation site, what is the long-term ambition for something like this? I mean, can you actually make this something where people could visit to get an idea, or is it just something that's fenced off that says private property, do not cross? What ends up happening to these sites in the long term?
Old Colchester was acquired by the Park Authority, and the Park Authority mission is to have these resources and to preserve them for the enjoyment of generations present, of current and future. And our dedication is first to understanding them, to preserving them, but then also to engaging with the public. And I think that this is of the utmost importance because our greatest support comes from the support of the citizens of Fairfax. They're fantastic with their support towards us. And although it's a preserve, so we're not going to develop it in a way that would disturb the cultural or natural resources. The planners had a very difficult job in doing that, but they worked out a master plan that is currently being finalized that does both. It preserves, but it brings the public there. We'll have trails that they can walk, interpretation, where they can get a better understanding of both the culture and the nature are all around them. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is we, both when I say we, the resources staff, natural and cultural, found an area where it could be a small development of an outdoor classroom. And I really like the idea of being able to bring students into the outside and let them engage, because so much of archaeology and so much of people and where they settle and how they settle and what they do is influenced by the environment and by the things as basic as the soils and the trees and the climate. And I really like the idea of being able to bring them out there. I think it provides a perspective that's difficult to attain in a classroom.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you go ahead and start doing more digs and search different areas of the county, you certainly do discover different types of people. And so when it comes to Native American history, there's certainly quite a bit of it. There's a lot of different tribes. In the area, you have the Occoquan to the southern portion of Fairfax, the Dogue Indians. How many different types of tribes, based off of the digs, have you been able to find in Fairfax?
It's a difficult thing to do, to ascribe things to what we think of as a tribe in the anthropological sense. Tribe suggests a certain shared culture, material culture, linguistics. The Dogue, of course, are some of the better known that were in Fairfax at the time of contact. But for the most part, those tribes would have been somewhat migratory. They would have resided in a certain area for a certain amount of time, and either because of environmental stresses or other stresses, would have been moving their villages as they go. A lot of times what we look at are these time periods where people move from being very, very migratory, hunter-gatherers, a small band, and then they develop more into localized hunter-gatherers. So they develop an annual cycle. And from there, the next step is it's the huge step, where now that they're coming back to the same areas on a regular basis, they start to realize, oh, well, this grows really well here. And I wonder what would happen if I took some of these seeds and rather than go to where the resources occur naturally, is to make the resources grow where I want them. And that is that step that takes you from being the hunter-gatherer and mobile to being the sedentary agriculturalist, horticulturalist, and then agriculturalists. And those are the people that John Smith meets and are the ones that they contact. Finding tribe or ascribing tribe can be difficult. Sometimes we can do it through aspects of the material culture, pottery. Decoration. The decoration that we see on pottery can sometimes be ascribed to certain specific cultures. But in general, we tend to look at things in a broader sense.
Now, when it comes to slave communities in the area, I know over in Sully Plantation, they were very proud of the fact that they had a slave cabin. Actually, I think 2 of them that they were able to build up and show in their original locations. And I know at Mount Vernon, they've gone ahead and tried to do more acknowledgement there. What kind of archaeological discoveries have been made in that respect?
The archaeology of slavery is very difficult because when we have poor European Americans, the materials they leave behind are oftentimes going to be much the same. What we have to start looking for when we look for slave occupation are usually lots of pieces that we can build an argument. And some of those pieces include architectural style. So sometimes the absence actually tells us a lot. The predominant architectural style for most people from the colonial period until about 1900 is post and ground wood frame houses. The dominant slave architecture, the architecture that's used for slave quarters, tends to be log cabin. And so you don't see those imprints of the post holes as you would with a post and ground structure. Then you start looking at other things. So minute differences. Cellars, we all pretty much know what a cellar is. But common to slave sites are interior, what we call subfloor pits. They're smaller. Some of the hypotheses are that they were either used by individuals or family groups as the slave family began to develop more for storage. And they seem to be particular to sites of enslavement, pre-emancipation African-American sites. Another is a form of pottery that we call colonoware. And this is usually unglazed courseware that is constructed in European forms. So it looks very much like Native American pottery, but the actual form, vessel shape, more closely mimics European ceramics. Finally, there are things that are suggestive. Beads, and in particular blue beads, glass beads, are very common on African American sites. Any one of these things in isolation is suggestive, but is not enough. Once you start accumulating several of these characteristics on a single site, and in particular, if then you can take the history of the site and begin to place slaves on the property, that's when you can really start thinking, okay, now we think we have a slave site here.
Now, so basically when it comes to archaeology, it's kind of like detective work for the most part, that's your notepad all the time. And so, in doing all of this, what would you say is probably the biggest find you yourself have actually done?
That's always an excellent question, and I'm always at a loss for how to answer it. Recently, there was a Fairfax County road crew that was working just outside of Fairfax City on an improvement project. And when they were excavating along the side of the road, they uncovered logs. And the logs turned out to be a portion of what we called a corduroy road, which was log roads that were put down in this area, especially during the Civil War. It was a highly developed area. We never expected to find it there. We never expected it to be there. But there they are, these nearly pristine cedar logs. From that, I could even go back and just say that first stone tool that I found as a 6-year-old in the field, in the cornfield. All of them are unique, and all of them have their special ability to contribute to the conversation of a people at a time and a place.
Now, let's say, summertime is just around the corner. I want to get involved. I want to come out and, for a few minutes, go ahead and live out the childhood dream of being Indiana Jones by doing an archaeological dig. Are people able to come out and volunteer to go ahead and be like a junior archaeologist for the day or a week, or is this something where it's kind of like, maybe you can come look, but we're concerned that you'll destroy everything instead?
Absolutely. I think that engaging with volunteers is probably one of the best ways of engagement, because there's that physical contact and there's the ownership. You're part of that project. So as a result, we have an active volunteer program. It had been mostly centered out of Colchester, but as we've been winding down the field work for there, a lot of it is based on what types of field activities we have at the time. And we do have active field projects in the lab, and people often don't realize this, that every hour that we spend in the field, you have to usually plan for about 2 hours in the lab. So for people who don't want to necessarily go outside with all the critters and the heat or the cold and the wet, we can use help in the lab. So we do have certain restrictions where volunteers must be, I believe it's 16 years or older, and even if they're over between 16 and 18, they have to at least at first be accompanied by a parent or guardian. We ask that they contact us and set up an orientation where we kind of inform them about the archaeological process, We tell them the types of work that we're doing, what their role would be, and then they spend a little bit of time doing some lab work. And then after that, if they feel that they have a taste for it, then they're welcome back. Usually we have lab volunteers on, I believe it's Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and some Saturdays. Field volunteers are Thursdays, Fridays, and some Saturdays. And to do that, you could look us up online. Officially, we are the Fairfax County Park Authority Cultural Resource Management and Protection Branch. Yeah, that's a mouthful. And the Colchester team is called CART, Colchester Archaeological Research Team. Now they're fanning out. They're becoming more the County Archaeological Research Team. And they operate a blog, and that's www.cartarchaeology.wordpress.com. And on either of those are links to the county volunteer site where we ask that you enroll, and that helps us maintain our hours and also plan. We've had days when we started Colchester where we had 12, 13 volunteers on one day, and you want to make sure that you can maximize, their utility. And so what we would do is then once we knew they were coming, we could be ready for them and have them just ready to start getting dirty.
Well, that's always good to know that you can come out and get ready. Now, in looking at this, there's certainly people who feel that, hey, this might be for me. Certainly learn more about archaeology as it is. And, the big thing is that, history is such an important tool to understand and learn, and archaeology being a part of that whole history field. What do you think is the most important aspect of understanding archaeological history when it comes to a 21st century society that has a majority of people now saying, why should we bother caring?
That's an interesting question. There is always the saying, although I can't say I've ever liked it, that those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. You can see a lot of parallels in history. You can see a lot of parallels in archaeology, not only about the people then, but how we got to where we are today. Aspects like things like consumerism. Ideal is the port town of Colchester in that, where you really are seeing that consumer revolution occurring. Globalization. We most often associate terms of globalization with things like the internet, but in the 18th century, the seas were opening up, and we had vessels that are traveling all around the Americas, from Liverpool to Europe to China, the East, bringing back materials. So the way that we dealt with experiencing other cultures then, I think are valuable lessons to learn even through today.
Well, it certainly is something to consider and think about, and it is a lot of fun. And so, certainly thank you for coming out to let us know all about Colchester and archaeology in Fairfax County. Lord knows, next time I'm driving along, I might have to pay attention more to the road than looking inside going, oh, maybe that's something really old, and let's check that out. But as a small thank you, we'd like to go ahead and give you a copy of our book here, Historic Cemeteries of Northern Virginia, which certainly maybe leads you into the path of more archaeological finds, and who knows, maybe a secret golden skull tomb, in which case we want full credit for that discovery.
We'll let you know.
As well. But when it comes to archaeology, certainly there is quite a bit to consider and learn about. Not everyone can be Indiana Jones, and as much as we like to put on the hat and carry a whip and pretend that there's Nazis chasing us, maybe not so much. But certainly, while Indy doesn't have his arch nemesis anymore, we ourselves can learn quite a bit from looking at our past and understanding how archaeology itself plays such an important role in our lives. To learn more about the Fairfax County Park Authority and certainly their archaeological division, because the mouthful for your title is a lot harder to say and remember than meets the eye, you can visit our website, www.timetravel21.com, or email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. This has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future, reminding you that not every rock on the ground is necessarily a rock. You might want to check it out a bit more than you think. Thanks for watching.